Grainy, shaking bodycam footage. The date stamp reads OCT 14, 2022. The audio is crisp, capturing the crunch of gravel and the heavy breathing of an officer. Get on the ground. I said get on the ground right now. The voice cracks with adrenaline. It is the voice of authority, but also of fear. It is 2:14 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. The sun is shining on a quiet, tree-lined street in Charlotte, North Carolina. There is no active shooter. There is no high-speed chase. There is only a 68-year-old man holding a pair of garden shears, standing in the driveway of a home he has owned for 22 years. The calm, confused voice of the older man. Officer, please, you're making a mistake. My name is Elijah. I own this. The officer cuts him off, screaming louder. Drop the weapon. Hands in the air. Do not move. In the span of 30 seconds, a routine afternoon of landscaping was about to spiral into a constitutional nightmare. On one side of the driveway stood Elijah Barnes, a retired high school principal, a deacon at his local church, and a pillar of the community. On the other side stood Officer Derek Miller, a rookie with less than 6 months on the force, his hand already trembling near his service weapon. What you are about to hear is not just a misunderstanding. It is a collision of bias, poor training, and the terrifying fragility of civil rights in America. It is a story of how quickly a lifetime of dignity can be stripped away by the presumption of guilt. But unlike so many tragic headlines we've seen in recent years, the story has a twist. Because Officer Miller didn't realize who he was talking to. And he certainly didn't realize that the man he was about to handcuff knew the law better than he did. This is the story of the arrest of Elijah Barnes. And what happened next would expose a department's failure and spark a citywide reckoning. To understand the gravity of what transpired on that October afternoon, we must first understand the two men whose lives intersected on that driveway. Elijah Barnes was not a stranger to the neighborhood of Oakwood Heights. In fact, he was its history. At 68 years old, Elijah was a man who wore his dignity like a suit of armor. For 40 years, he had served the Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system, rising from a history teacher to the principal of Westover High. He was the kind of educator who knew 3 generations of families by name. He had broken up fights, mentored at-risk youth, and navigated the complex bureaucracy of the education system. He was a man of rules, of order, and of immense patience. Since retiring, Elijah had invested his pension into real estate, buying dilapidated properties in his old neighborhood, and restoring them to provide affordable housing. He took pride in doing the maintenance himself. It was his meditation. On October 14, 2022, he was at one of his rental properties, preparing the landscaping for a new tenant who was moving in the following week. He was wearing a faded UNC Tar Heels t-shirt and work boots. To anyone who knew him, he was Mr. Barnes. Then, there was Officer Derek Miller, 23 years old, fresh out of the academy. Miller was part of a new wave of recruits brought in to address the city's staffing shortages. Records obtained later would show that Miller had struggled in high-stress simulation training, often escalating scenarios that required de-escalation. He had been on the street for 5 months. Still in his probationary period, the psychology of a rookie officer is often driven by a dangerous cocktail of uncertainty and the warrior cop mentality, instilled during training the idea that every encounter is a potential ambush, and that compliance must be secured immediately. At any cost, the context of the location is equally critical. Oakwood Heights was a neighborhood in transition. Rapid gentrification had brought in new, wealthier residents who were unfamiliar with the long-standing community members. The dynamic of neighbors calling the police on neighbors had become a friction point in the area. At 2:08 p.m., a 911 call was placed by a resident who had moved onto the street 3 weeks prior. 911 call recording dispatcher. 911. What is your emergency? Caller. Yes, there's a suspicious man at the empty house on 4th Street. He's walking around the back with a knife or something. He looks like he's trying to break in. Dispatcher. Can you describe him? Caller. He's an African-American male, older. He looks agitated. A subjective descriptor that would set the tone for the police response. The dispatcher coded the call not as a property check, but as a burglary in progress. This distinction is legally significant. It primed Officer Miller for a felony confrontation before he even put his car in park. When Officer Miller arrived, he didn't see a property owner caring for his investment. He saw a suspect fitting a description. He didn't see a grandfather. He saw a threat. And in the eyes of the law, the difference between a consensual encounter and an investigative detention often hangs on the officer's perception of that threat. But perception is not evidence. And as Elijah Barnes was about to demonstrate, being black in your own driveway is not a crime. The escalation began the moment Officer Miller's cruiser screeched to a halt. At 2:14 p.m., standard police procedure, particularly the Fourth Amendment principles governing Terry stops, requires an officer to have reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime has occurred, is occurring, or is about to occur to detain someone. While the 911 call provided a basis to investigate, it did not provide carte blanche to bypass all investigative steps. Officer Miller exited the vehicle. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask a question. He immediately drew his taser and pointed it at Elijah Barnes. Elijah, holding hedge clippers, looked up, squinting against the sun. He didn't run. He didn't drop the tools immediately because the command didn't register he wasn't a criminal. His brain wasn't wired to expect an armed confrontation while gardening. Officer Miller, bodycam, drop it. Drop it now or you're gonna get lit up. Elijah, son, calm down. These are clippers. Elijah slowly placed the shears on the grass and raised his hands, palms open. His movements were deliberate. He knew that a sudden motion could be fatal. At this moment, the contrast in composure is striking. The 68-year-old civilian is the one managing the scene, while the trained professional is hyperventilating. Officer Miller, turn around. Face the car. Hands on your head. Elijah, officer, I am the property owner. My name is Elijah Barnes. My wallet is in my back pocket. It has my ID, and the deed card is in the truck. You don't need to do this by 16 p.m. The interaction had moved from a potential misunderstanding to an unlawful detention. Officer Miller ignored the claim of ownership. In his mind, the narrative was set: suspect caught in the act. Suspect is lying. This is a cognitive bias known as confirmation bias, interpreting every piece of new information. To support your pre-existing belief, Officer Miller closed the distance, holstering his taser but keeping his hand on his firearm. Officer Miller, I don't care who you say you are. You match the description of a burglar. Turn around. Elijah, I am not turning around until you tell me why I am being detained. I have answered your questions. I am on my own property. Under North Carolina law, unless I am under arrest, I have no obligation to. Officer Miller didn't let him finish. He perceived the assertion of rights as resistance. This is a critical flashpoint in modern policing. Contempt of cop, while not a legal charge, it is the underlying motivation for thousands of unnecessary arrests. When an officer's authority is questioned, the ego often overrides the policy. At 2:17 p.m., Officer Miller keyed his radio. But he didn't call for a supervisor. He called for an assist, code 10-18, implying an urgent situation. Officer Miller radio, dispatch, subject is non-compliant, refusing commands, possible weapon on the ground. Send backup, non-compliant. Elijah Barnes was standing still with his hands in the air. He was speaking in a level tone. He was offering identification. To characterize this as non-compliant was a distortion of reality that would later haunt the department in court. Elijah tried one more time to reach the human being behind the badge. Elijah, young man, look at me. I'm old enough to be your grandfather. I was the principal at Westover High for 15 years. I'm not going to fight you. Just walk over to my truck and look at the paperwork on the seat for a split second. Officer Miller hesitated. The adrenaline wavered. But then, a neighbor, not the caller, but another resident, stepped onto their porch across the street to watch. The audience was present. Officer Miller felt the pressure to perform, to dominate the space. Officer Miller, last warning. Turn around. Elijah sighed, the weight of the situation settling in. He knew the drill. He had given the talk to hundreds of young black men over the years. Survive the encounter. Win the lawsuit. Elijah, fine. I'm turning around. I am doing this under duress. Elijah slowly turned his back. The time was 19 p.m. The physical integrity of a community elder was about to be violated. Officer Miller rushed forward, grabbing Elijah's left wrist with excessive force. twisting it up toward his shoulder blades. Elijah, easy. Easy. I have arthritis in that shoulder. Officer Miller, stop resisting. Stop resisting. The phrase was shouted for the benefit of the body cam microphone, a cover-your-tracks tactic used to justify force after the fact. But the video shows Elijah's feet planted firmly. The only movement was a flinch of pain as his rotator cuff was strained beyond its limit. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. The birds were still singing. The sun was still shining. But in that driveway, the social contract had been shattered. A man who had spent his life upholding rules was being treated like a menace to society by a man who didn't know the first thing about the community he was sworn to protect. The click of handcuffs is a sound you never forget. It is mechanical, final, and dehumanizing. At 2:20 p.m., Elijah Barnes, a man who had shaken hands with mayors and superintendents, felt cold steel bite into his wrist. The humiliation was visceral. Officer Miller didn't just cuff him. He shoved him forward toward the patrol car. Elijah stumbled, his work boots scuffing the pavement. Elijah, you are making a grave mistake. Officer, I hope your body camera is on. Officer Miller, it's on. And it's recording you going to jail for breaking and entering and resisting arrest. Officer Miller patted him down aggressively, emptying Elijah's pockets. He pulled out a leather wallet. He didn't open it. He tossed it onto the hood of the cruiser. He pulled out keys. Tossed them. He was treating Elijah's possessions as contraband. By now, a small crowd had gathered. These weren't just curious onlookers. Some were former students. A young woman, recognized later as Sarah Jenkins, a nurse who lived 3 doors down, approached cautiously. Sarah Jenkins, hey, that's Mr. Barnes. What are you doing? He owns that house. Officer Miller whipped his head around, his panic morphing into aggression toward the bystanders. Officer Miller, back up. Stay back or you're next for obstruction. The threat silenced the crowd, but it didn't stop them from recording. Cell phones were raised. The digital witnesses were logging every second. Inside Elijah's mind, a different battle was waging. He described it later in sworn deposition. I felt my heart racing. Not from guilt, but from rage. I had to swallow it. I had to bury 40 years of pride because I knew if I raised my voice, if I gave him 1 inch of excuse, I might not make it home to my wife. I felt the heat of the car hood against my cheek. I smelled the exhaust, and I felt a profound sadness for this young man who thought this was what power looked like. Officer Miller shoved Elijah into the back of the cruiser. The space was cramped. The hard plastic seat was unforgiving. The windows were rolled up, and the interior was stifling. Elijah sat there, handcuffed behind his back, his shoulders screaming in agony. For 12 agonizing minutes, he sat. Officer Miller paced outside, speaking rapidly into his radio, running the license plate of Elijah's truck. Dispatch, plate comes back to Elijah Barnes. There was a pause on the radio. Copy, Unit 4 Alpha. Is the suspect claiming to be the owner? Officer Miller, he's claiming it, but he fits the description. He was holding a weapon. I have him detained. Officer Miller was now trapped in his own error. The license plate matched the name Elijah had given. A rational officer would have paused, checked the ID on the hood, and de-escalated. But Officer Miller was committed to the narrative of the arrest. To back down now would be to admit fault. This is known as sunk cost fallacy in psychology, continuing a behavior as a result of previously invested resources, time, effort, ego, regardless of the outcome. He leaned into the window. Officer Miller, we're waiting on my sergeant. Then we're taking you down to processing. You can tell your story to the judge. Elijah, the deed is in the glove box, son. Just look in the glove box. Officer Miller, I'm not searching your vehicle without a warrant. Sit tight. The irony was suffocating. Officer Miller was violating the Fourth Amendment by detaining him without probable cause, yet citing procedural constraints to avoid exonerating him. The crisis peaked at 2:30 p.m. Elijah, feeling lightheaded from the stress and the heat, slumped against the window. He closed his eyes. The neighbors watched in silent horror. The man who had built that community was caged like an animal in the middle of it. It seemed, for a terrifying moment, that the system would simply swallow him whole, as it had done so many others. But then, another car turned the corner. The vehicle that arrived at 2:33 p.m. was a marked SUV. Sergeant David Henderson stepped out. Henderson was a 20-year veteran of the force. He was calm, deliberate, and commanded the scene instantly. He didn't run. He walked out. He saw Officer Miller, pacing and sweating. He saw the gathered crowd, phone cameras trained on the scene. And he saw the silver-haired man in the back of the cruiser. Sergeant Henderson, Miller. What do we have? Officer Miller, burglary suspect, Sarge, caught him in the driveway with a knife. He resisted. I had to detain him. Sergeant Henderson looked at the knife lying in the grass, a pair of Fisker's gardening shears. He looked at the truck parked in the driveway. He looked at the pristine condition of the house. His brow furrowed. He walked over to the cruiser and peered through the glass. His eyes widened. Henderson didn't just recognize the suspect. He recognized the man who had suspended his own son 15 years ago for skipping class, and then spent 3 weeks tutoring him after school so he could graduate. Sergeant Henderson opened the door. Miller, Officer Miller, Sarge, he's agitated. He might. Sergeant Henderson open the door now. The tone was not a request. It was an order that cut through Officer Miller's panic. Officer Miller fumbled for the handle and opened the door. Sergeant Henderson, Mr. Barnes. Elijah, hello, David. It's been a while. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. The color drained from Officer Miller's face. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The suspect and the sergeant were on a first-name basis. Sergeant Henderson, get these cuffs off him. Immediately. Officer Miller. But Sarge, the caller said. Sergeant Henderson, I don't care what the caller said. You didn't run the ID. You didn't check the property records. That is Mr. Elijah Barnes. He owns half the block. Officer Miller uncuffed Elijah. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped the key once. As the metal clicked open, Elijah didn't rub his wrist. He stepped out, straightened his shirt, and stood to his full height. He looked at Officer Miller, not with anger, but with a piercing disappointment. Elijah, you didn't listen. I told you everything you needed to know in the first 10 seconds. But you were too busy trying to be a hero to be a police officer. Sergeant Henderson turned to Officer Miller. Sergeant Henderson, go sit in your car. Turn off your radio. Do not speak to anyone. As Officer Miller retreated to his vehicle, the dynamic of power completely inverted. Sergeant Henderson apologized profusely, offering to call a medic for Elijah's shoulder. Elijah, I don't want a medic, David. I want his badge number. I want the bodycam footage preserved. And I want to file a formal complaint before the sun goes down. Little did they know. The cell phone video taken by Sarah Jenkins, the nurse across the street, had already been uploaded to Twitter. By the time Elijah was driving himself to the urgent care to have his shoulder examined, the video had 50,000 views. By the evening news, it would be in the millions. The turning point wasn't just the arrival of the sergeant. It was the moment the shield of qualified immunity began to crack under the weight of undeniable incompetence. The narrative Officer Miller tried to build of a dangerous burglar had collapsed. The truth was out in the open air. The aftermath of October 14th was swift and severe. The video of a 23-year-old rookie manhandling a beloved 68-year-old educator sparked outrage across Charlotte. Protests were organized outside the precinct. The hashtag Justice for Mer Barnes trended nationally. Elijah Barnes followed through. He didn't just file a complaint. He filed a federal civil rights lawsuit alleging unlawful search and seizure, excessive force, and assault. The evidence was overwhelming. The bodycam footage, released 3 weeks later due to public pressure, confirmed everything Elijah had said. It showcased Officer Miller's aggression, his refusal to look at ID, and his escalation of a non-criminal situation. 11 months later, the city settled with Elijah Barnes for $350,000, but for Elijah, it wasn't about the money. As part of the settlement, he demanded and received a mandatory policy change for the department, known locally as the Barnes Protocol. It requires officers responding to property calls to verify ownership through tax records or lease agreements before initiating physical detainment, unless there is an immediate threat to life. As for Officer Derek Miller, the Internal Affairs investigation found that he had violated four separate department policies, including de-escalation protocols and use of force guidelines. He was placed on unpaid leave and subsequently resigned. Before termination proceedings could be finalized, his law enforcement certification was flagged, making it difficult for him to be hired by another agency in the state. The neighbor who made the 911 call was also identified, while not charged criminally. They were publicly shamed by the community and reportedly moved out of the neighborhood 6 months later. Elijah Barnes used the settlement money to start a scholarship fund for students at Westover High interested in studying criminal justice and law. In an interview after the settlement, Elijah sat in his garden, the same garden where he was handcuffed, and offered this reflection. Elijah: "They tried to take my dignity that day. They tried to make me small. But all they did was show the world how much work we still have to do. I don't hate that young man. I pity him. He had a gun and a badge, but he didn't have the one thing that matters most: respect for the people he serves." Elijah Barnes survived his encounter. He had the knowledge, the community support, and the presence of mind to navigate a life-threatening situation. But for every Elijah Barnes, there are countless others whose stories end in tragedy, whose rights are trampled in the shadows, without viral videos or settlements to vindicate them. This was just one chapter in the ongoing saga of accountability in America. It serves as a reminder that knowing your rights is a shield, but systemic change is the only true cure. We will continue to bring these real-life chapters to light, exposing the failures and celebrating the victories of justice. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. And we want to hear from you in the comments. If you were in Elijah's shoes, standing in your own driveway with a rookie cop screaming at you, what would you have done? Thanks for watching. Stay safe and know your rights.